Sure. Uh, um, but about 8 years back, I went to Indonesia to visit a place called Borobudur. And it's the largest Buddhist edifice. I use that word because sometimes it's called a temple, but it's not a temple because it's completely solid. There's no hallway inside or anything like it. It's just a massive, solid, I think 2 million blocks of rock. And it is huge. It really is huge. I mean, there are statistics about how big it is, but just think huge. And there is something very special about Borobudur, which is really different from any other Buddhist archaeological site. And that is that in itself, it has everything about the Dharma. It's a complete entity in its own right. It's got every level of the Dharma. And we're going to sort of explore that a little bit. So very, very basically, it's got thousands of bas relief. To give you it's got thousands all the way around and hundreds of statues of Buddhas. And in one way of, there are a couple of ways of thinking about it, but one way of thinking is it's a 3D educational edifice on Buddhism. You walk around, it's like 3 miles to walk around every bit. And it teaches you, it's a teaching aid, it teaches you everything visually about Buddhism, from the basis right up to the highest teachings. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that it's symbolic of a process or a path of transformation from your very basic raw mind states to the most elevated, exalted mind states. It embodies the whole thing. And what I suggest is that at some point afterwards, when you go home, you Google it, images from aerial photographs, because aerial photographs show you very clearly that it is a mandala with all its concentric squares and concentric circles and a stupa at the top. Another way of looking at it is that the whole thing is a massive stupa, or symbol of the whole cosmology, Buddhist cosmology, with all the elements, earth, water, fire, air, space, consciousness, Buddha mind. Everything is embodied in it. So it's a mandala, it's a spiral, which you go up, and it's a stupa. So it's all those things. What serves me very well in this is that I can use this idea of this 3-dimensional mandala to talk about ways of working with the mind and in meditation. So there's a base of the mandala represents ordinary worldly experience. with all its vicissitudes and suffering and polarities, its strife and difficulty, and the ways that we engage in the world easily or with difficulty. So the whole base represents the world, you could say, and all worldly way of thinking or approaching our lives. So I want to say a few words about that in terms of, to use a particular phrase, taking yourself on. You might, part of the process of being mindful and meditation is you learn things about yourself. I'll give you an example of a topic that I've been teaching recently. And it came out of breakfast in the house. I live in a Buddhist community, and someone said, "Oh, I had a terrible night yesterday evening. I tried to call my girlfriend and I couldn't get through, and I just assumed the worst. I assumed that she'd been attacked and all kinds of terrible things had happened, and then I realized she'd just gone to bed early." And we talked about that, what is the first thought that happens when you hear something or you think of something? And I got a telephone call from my mother, who just happens to be 104, and someone said, "Oh no!" And I said, "It's just a call from my mother, it's not, she's dead or going to hospital having an episode. It's just a telephone call." So it was very interesting, because when I opened this up in, excuse me, in other situations, I teach in a big bank, and everyone said, "I do that, I do that, I do that." And so this is an area of mindfulness, because if your mind is, the first thing it's doing is catastrophizing to some degree, from minor to major, that definitely colors your experience and how you are and what you do. So part of practicing mindfulness is to actually notice that, to be aware of that, to learn that you have that tendency. Now, you might rationalize it and say, well, bad things happen, but that's not the point. Of course they do. There are people in the bank, this big international bank, from the Ukraine and former Soviet countries, and bad things happen. We know that they happen. But they're finding, and they're definitely working on it, is letting go of that anticipation or expectation immediately that something bad has happened. And just being actually open and fresh in the moment to what's happening, without any background anticipation that it's all going to go wrong. So working with yourself or on yourself is part of that process, becoming aware of tendencies like that and turning them around and letting go of them, changing them, just to be much more fresh. What is happening, actually? What is the real situation here? It's just a telephone call, or whatever it is. Just one more thing about that. Sometimes traveling on the tube or the bus, I observe people get triggered and act out because they assume someone is looking at them in an aggressive or bad way. what are you looking at? Don't look at me. I'm fine. I'm not looking at you. You know, and you get all kinds of arguments starting in the tube. If you ever go in the tube, you might have seen this, and it's ridiculous. You know, it's nothing. You just assume they're assuming the worst. So that I'm just using that as an example about mindfulness and meditation and awareness of yourself, helping you learn about patterns that you have that you can then kind of assess and get a perspective on them. Is it true? Is it really like that? And I came up with something, which is, you probably at least have heard of Harry Potter. And in Harry Potter, there's the ridiculous spell. And adapting the Harry Potter ridiculous, which is spelled with a K, spell, and you look at a tendency and you assess it as ridiculous. And you get out your mental wand and you go, ridiculous, and laugh at it. And a funny thing happens then, that it dissolves and disappears. It goes, who are you calling ridiculous? And disappears. And so I would suggest that you give the ridiculous spell a go. That's ridiculous. And just see what happens. You know, the world is going to end tomorrow. That's ridiculous. You know, and just try it. Just see what happens. So I want to move up the the whole edifice. There's all these levels of what you could describe as more refined experience, which has to do with practicing the Dharma, you know, so coming strongly into an ethical sense and awareness of what causes suffering and acting accordingly to overcome those tendencies, becoming more absorbed in your meditation, having positive qualities in your meditation like kindness and patience and care and motivation to practice, so that this whole area of the mandala actually is a part of one's life where you are engaged in Dharma practice. You're reflecting on the Buddhist teaching and starting to assess it, see how it relates to you, how you relate to it, and applying the principles of working with the mind and against hindrances and things that hold you back, so that your mind becomes more inspired, actually, and having a general sense of positivity. So there's this whole section of the mandala of the mind becoming purer. And you then get to the top of Borobudur, and there is no form there. There are no sculptures, but there are Buddhas in stupas. And this represents, as it were, the highest level of formlessness in Buddhism, what is called shunyata, or the open dimension of being, you could say, or Buddha mind. So the whole thing is a process of coming into Buddha mind, starting from, in a way, base level. And in terms of working on yourself with becoming more refined and perceptive in your meditation, I would suggest, if you haven't already, go on retreat. Take time to go on retreat, and even if you feel that it would be useful for you, solitary retreats. Just taking a bit of time on your own, meditating, reflecting. And this really helps with all the levels, actually, but particularly that level of refinement and sensitivity. And it gives you space for reflection. So I'm going to finish in a moment. But I just want to, in a way, re-emphasize that you can be on a path. And you might sometimes feel that you're sliding back, but you're still on a path, and you're applying the principles of mindfulness and positivity and reality. Is that ridiculous or not? To what's happening and how you see things. So in that way, over time, and this links back to what I said before the tea break, you start to get the clear confidence in your progress, that actually you directly get the sense that you are changing. And there is a sense of improvement, even in the way that you attend to people and how you relate to people, and your work and your creativity and in your thinking. So that confidence comes from experience. It's not just a mind-made thing. So having a sense of yourself entering into a mandala of progress, of spiral, and knowing in a way that you definitely are on it, and committing even to it, really makes a big difference.